We always kind of start this off with just asking, and it's this really simple question, but I think can go a lot of ways. What was the incident or what was the trigger? What was the moment that kind of brought you into therapy?
I was in college at, NC State University. It was my sophomore year, and I was literally in the bed, like, the whole 1st semester, and I was dealing with some issues, primarily, at that point, it was just, like, abandonment issues and depression, and there was a Burger King right down the street from the dorm that I lived in, and I would sleep all day, get up, walk there, and eat 1 meal a day. That's how depressed I was. That was I was. And so, just in talking to friends and family, and everybody was like, "You really need to, look into getting some help." And I did. And it wasn't what I thought it would be initially, but, it was like, you know, the beginning of a great journey.
So it sounds like that moment that initially started was sort of that transitional life stage, which is a huge transition. A lot of people don't realize that, like, when you go to college, there's a reason why they say the freshman 15 and all the other things they tell you to look out for, right? It's like you at least in the States, I will say, most of our parents don't parent us to be fully free thinking, analytical, critical thinking type adults. You're more so raised with like these deep seated things instilled in you so that you can survive, so that you can make a great living. But it's really around compliance, right? And so you get thrust into this world where you're supposed to like learn how to like critically think and figure out things on your own, and we're not taught in school and a lot of times even at home how to bridge emotional connections and how to get our needs met, our emotional needs met. And so you're sitting here and hopefully you have some sort of support in the university, right? Or at on campus, right? But you're in this unfamiliar territory. So you're really a foreigner in your own land trying to figure out things with very few vices internally or even externally. So it's a huge process to navigate in and of itself.
It was, and I came from a very close-knit, big family. My mom is one of 8. So, when I left to go to college, it was like, "Oh, it's great, it's gonna be fun, you're gonna learn." And then when I get there, it's, like, totally different. The first year was great, but going into the 2nd year, it was, challenging.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's an experience, and that's a whole episode in of itself, how we don't adequately prepare kids to go to college and what that actually means. Like, I thought, you can go to class, you don't have to go to class. No, I found out they had very strict policies around, you miss more than 3 times, your letter grade gets dropped. I was like, "Wait, what?" I thought I just showed up, took the test, and I could ace it, and
Yeah.
okay,
And for
something
me,
about
it
the
was
test.
about maturity. I didn't have the
Mm,
maturity, um,
mm.
to do what I needed to do the first time around, not even the 2nd or 3rd time around, it took a while.
Yeah. Talk a little bit more about that part though. Like when you say maturity, I'm assuming you mean both like cognitive maturity, but also like emotional maturity in terms of handling things, your ability to react and respond to things. What do you kind of mean by that?
I was I'm an only child, and, I was raised with cousins, who I was really close to, and still am to this day, but, it was just me and my mom growing up, so everything was, it was kinda like a democracy. I had decisions, I could make. It wasn't like, "You do this, is what I say, what I say goes." It was very I had choices, so when I got to college, it was like, I had more choices, and I took it and kinda ran with it, but I wasn't making the right choices. So that led to, um, a lot of issues with just not balancing things the way I needed to, which also, led to depression. Some of it was genetic, mental health issues running my family, but a lot of it was that lack of maturity. You know, at this point, I'm struggling. I'm not going to class, I'm not doing any of the things I need to do, and that would serve the purpose for me being there. So, I was thinking about it, but I wasn't sure if that's what would work or if that's what I needed to do because that wasn't something I was raised around. I had kinda got the message that, you just deal with it or pray it away or, you know, that was what I was raised, in.
And then when you finally went, did it give you clarity? Like, what was the outcome of when you finally went?
When I finally went, I thought it would be very overnight, like, "Oh, I'll just go and I'll feel better," and I realized, it's work. It's what I call an inside job. So, it was kinda disappointing, again, because of that lack of maturity, and when I did, s kinda get the idea that, "Okay, this is gonna take work," I had to change therapists, I've been through, you know, different ones. Sometimes it wasn't a match, sometimes the approach wasn't right for me, and it's just like anything else, it's work, You have to find that one that fit, and as things change, as you evolve, as you heal, as you grow, things change, so you may need to, adjust and keep moving, but it's a forward journey.
Yeah. Would you say when you went in, I know a lot of clients, I know being a client, but also being a therapist, I know a lot of clients, sometimes when they look back in hindsight, they're like, initially, I thought therapy would be I get this expert and they tell me how to fix it. Like they'll fix it for me essentially. And so when you said inside job, it sounds like at some point after you went, it was disappointing to know these external people can't fix this, but that you there was an acceptance of internally this is a process that I might be on for a while.
Yes, and I realize, no one can fix it for you. It's hard to fix it yourself, but you have these people and they facilitate and they guide you toward, a better person, a better outcome, better relationships. So it's been literally a journey.
Yeah. When you think about hindsight's always 2020. And when you think about finally going to therapy, when you think about studying things and learning things about the mental health field, right? And you think about getting a diagnosis. Like one of the biggest things I talk to folks about is whether it's a depressive episode, anxiety, or just whatever, getting the diagnosis, right? What that means. And there's so much stigma around it. For everybody, it's different. For some people, it's paralyzing and it's stigmatizing and it feels very abnormal, very fear based. And then for some folks, I'm the weird one that I'll say, it felt very relieving, almost like, oh, this makes sense. This is why this was happening. This is why that was happening. For you, when you look back in hindsight, do you feel like, going to somebody and finding out the why behind some of the things, did that help you to have more insight into, oh, this is why this was the way it was, or why this affects me this way?
Yeah, the diagnosis didn't come for years later. I was in and out of therapy, going to see therapists at the university, at the health center, and but it didn't come till much later after my manic episode. So when I did receive that diagnosis, it was after the manic episode. I finally found a doctor that was willing to say, okay, this is what we have here. And it was very freeing in a way, but I did face the fear and, I felt the stigma, even within personal relationships. I would say, "Well, this is what I've been dealing with," or, "This is what it is," and I even had someone say, "Oh, no, that's not true." They say that to everyone. So, having that negated or, feeling like you're not being validated in a sense. It's hard, but you have to get to that place where you're like, "Okay, this is not something I'm shouting from the rooftops, but I am willing to accept it and work through it and use it as a tool."
And so when you say, because I know a lot of people that see this podcast or hear this podcast may not know what mania is or having a manic episode. So would you mind kind of sharing a little bit more about what your diagnosis is and how that showed up for you? Because it's a spectrum, so it shows up very differently for different people. So how did that show up for what is it and how did it show up for you particularly?
I'm diagnosed with bipolar 1 disorder. For me, it shows up as very high highs and very low lows. It's, anything from irritability to, um, delusions of grandeur at, extreme points, and that's only happened once. But, mainly for me, it's just the depression, it's especially in the winter months. Sun starts going down earlier, so you're getting less sunlight, and in comes Mr. Depression. So, it's challenging, but, it's been something that I've been able to work through. It does get better, there is hope, and I think that's, what I really want people to know.
Mhm. I wonder, I'm curious about this, and I've talked to many people with many different diagnoses, myself included, that weren't diagnosed for a very long time. And the thing that a lot of people don't know is clinicians who are licensed to diagnose. The only thing that our license doesn't cover is diagnosing what used to be access to or like developmental disorders. And that's what we leave to psychologists. So psychologists are the ones that do the developmental disorders because they have to do evaluation and testing. But psychiatrists, psychologists, and licensed clinicians can do clinical diagnosis. But often I find that people can go through a bevy of therapists, clinically licensed therapists, and they sometimes even receive help, but never a diagnosis. And being a licensed marriage and family therapist, diagnoses aren't high on our list. We like to look at the whole person and not really focus on the diagnosis. But I do think it can be helpful to know and for the client to know what it is they're working with to have the supports that they need. So for you and your experience, when you think back, why do you think it was such a struggle? Not for you because it wasn't your job to do the diagnosis, but for the clinicians that you worked with to diagnose you appropriately.
I think it's hard to be the bearer of bad news, and sometimes, especially in our society, it's so stigmatized. No one wants to say, "Well, you have bipolar, or you have," whatever the diagnosis is, because it can be so debilitating for some people, and I think that's where the another lens of stigma comes in. It's like, if I tell this person that, what are they gonna do with it? You can only control what you say, you can't control what's done after that.
Yeah, and I'd honestly make the argument that avoiding telling somebody stigmatizes it further, and really, I've always shared clinical diagnosis with my clients or the diagnosis that I believe, because diagnosing is very subjective. Like there's tools that we use, but it's very subjective from professional to professional. And if I believe a person has something, I'll tell them the criteria that they met as far as my subjective lens, my professional lens, and tell them why. But I think the more we normalize it, right? The less we hide in the shadows of it, then it doesn't make somebody feel like they're the bearer of bad news. You know what I mean? Like I'm bearing bad news to you. Like, oh, I'm sorry to have to tell you this. To me, that's what keeps the secrecy and shame around something that we can't change our DNA. We can't change the way our brain functions if we're atypical in any type of way. That's what we can do is figure out how do we work best and then get some tools for how to show up in this world so that we can always be the best version we can be of ourselves that day, given the tools we have internally and externally. So, I'm sorry that wasn't your experience earlier on. No, no blame to the clinicians, but I'm hoping that our profession can move forward in a space where we open up to these possibilities that whether it's, autism, ADHD, bipolar, schizophrenia, whatever it is that, somebody a diagnosis that somebody carries, that's not the total sum of who they are, but that's a intricate part that they may be able to utilize that information in order to help them. It's a scary thing when you're navigating and you have no clue as to why you're feeling a certain way. 'Cause I was going back to words you had said earlier on, Kara, when you said you weren't mature enough and you struggled with that, and while I do think, I mean, we struggle with maturity at that age. I mean, our prefrontal cortex isn't even fully developed at that age. But I also think that when you look back at that age, you also viewed it from the lens that you had, and that was without a diagnosis, and you think about impulsivity and things. I'm thinking about even with ADHD, thinking about some of the things that I thought was my immaturity, and really it was some of the characteristics of my ADHD that may have been present even 10 years later. I just learned how to manage them better. And so I thought about somehow sometimes when you have somebody to give you that knowledge, then it doesn't absolve you from doing the best you can, but it does at least give context to what's happening versus you feeling lazy, feeling like, I'm just being immature, I'm being a brat. I was, Matt and I were interviewing somebody last week, and I was telling them about a quote that I saw on Instagram, and it was basically saying that Black women often feel like we're lazy or we judge ourselves really harshly and feel like we failed when really we're just anxious or depressed or overwhelmed. And so it's harder to pinpoint our anxiety, our depression, our trauma because we're classifying it as behavioral issues that we should have been able to control. And so we often feel like we failed.
Absolutely, I identify with that, and it takes work
Yeah.
to get to the space and the mind frame that, this is real life issues. These are I'm not lazy, I'm not, unproductive. I'm traumatized.
Yeah.
I'm tired,
Yeah.
you know? So, yeah.
And I have two more questions. One really quickly I want to ask you is I know because I've talked to you before, so I know people are often shocked when you tell them your diagnosis because there's this stigma, there's this presentation of what people think bipolar is, and then there's Kara showing up always fashionable. I know you don't think you always are, but to me, you always are fashionable, like very conscientious, very insightful, very aware, um, very compassionate, all the things that people don't think people with bipolar can be and can have, here you are. And so I heard you say earlier about how people have negated the diagnosis, and I've had that many times with ADHD. Well, Sheree, you're focused. You've been able to go to school. You've been able to do this, and I'm like, I made it in spite of, not because of. And yes, I do still have the diagnosis. For you, what has it been like being somebody who is contradictory to what that stigma is, that impression people have of your particular diagnosis, and you being none of those things. Kara's not any of those things. Kara may have shown behaviors like some of those things, but Kara herself isn't any of those things. What is it like for you to live in that space of, I'm not the face of what they think I'm supposed to be? And so they try to dismiss it because,
It's hard, and at times it's infuriating. Um, in 2000 I think it was the end of 2019, I went to Maryland and did a speaking engagement, and, at the end of it, the hostess looked at me and said, "You're not bipolar. Oh, no, you're not bipolar." And, it was like, well, what does that mean? What does that even mean? Like, what does that how does that make people feel who fit the bill, you know? how what does that say to them? And it just makes me wanna advocate more and be more passionate and, just stay rooted in my work.
Absolutely. I love that. I love that. And I know that you've done that, and I remember being so pissed off when you told me that person said that, and I was like, "They did what?" They said, "What?" I think that's a
Yeah.
hard thing that people think they're complimenting you when really, in fact, you're negating part of me that I've been able to not just, like, live through, but I've also been able to be a warrior for and advocate for. I always tell people, and I tell a lot of my clients who happen to be ADHD, like, that is also my superpower. It may be your Achilles heel in dealing with me in some of those ADHD components, but for me, some of who I am, some of my ability to think a certain way, some of my ability to have compassion in a certain way has been as a result of it. So I've learned to also benefit from and prosper from something that can be quite difficult for many of us that experience it, and the subsequent anxiety and depression and OCD and things that come along sometimes for some of us with those diagnoses. There's an acceptance of I'm a sum of all my parts. And if you negate part of my parts, then you negate my experience. And that's really what I hear you saying.
Yes, absolutely. It's kinda like saying, "Well, we're not gonna talk about color," or "I don't see color." Well, if you don't see, acknowledge bipolar, you don't see me. Because like you said, it's all together. It's all one piece. Good, bad, right or wrong, ugly, indifferent, it's all wrapped up in there, and it makes me me.
Yeah. What would you say? And this is my final question, unless Matt has something else to ask. What would you say to somebody who's out there? I think there's so many different stories that we can tell, and I think there's somebody out there that each of us has something that'll resonate with folks. So for the folks that may have resonated with your story today, or like they're like, that's kind of me, or I see myself in that lady. Like, what is something that you would tell them if they've been considering therapy? They've been considering kind of looking into whether it's bipolar they think they have, or just anything that they're experiencing. They've been thinking about it, teetering on seeking some support, and they're just unsure. What would you tell them?
I would say go for it. It's definitely worth it. And yes, it's work, but it's the work that you wake up every day and it's like, "I'm glad I did that."
So, would you say your life as it is today is a result of the work that you've done over the years?
Absolutely. I do feel as though the work I've put in, my faith, my family, my support system, my wonderful mentors like you, um, you know, it's all result of some of the work I've put in and what people pour into me.
And I feel like, you're just at this step in your journey where I've even seen you grow over the years, but I tell you all the time, the amount of change, the amount of impact that I just see you making, even just in this field of mental health, but just in general, the people who will be impacted by not just your story, but also the grace and compassion with which you share it, and the openness and the vulnerability and the transparency with which you share it. I think continued conversations like this lends to tearing down and dismantling the kind of structures that have been built around supporting the stigmatization of any mental health diagnosis at all. So I'm so excited that we could have you on today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.